Thank you for joining us for Video 3 of Copyright Basics, the ins and outs for effective teaching and learning. This video will focus on fair use, Section 107 of copyright law. Fair use is often regarded as the most important exception to the exclusive rights of copyright owners. It can also be the most ambiguous exception to apply. Today, we will focus on what fair use is and what it covers, as well as the concept of transformative use. We will also cover the fair use guidelines, which are not law, but which can be used as a baseline for reference. Let's get started. So what is fair use and why is it important? Section 107 of copyright law defines fair use, which allows for the reproduction of works for the purpose of criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. Just from that definition, we can see that fair use is extremely important in education. Without fair use, you could not, for example, hand out an article to your students in your face-to-face class or write a review of a book. So much of what we do in the classroom depends on this exception, but here's the catch. Fair use is not a blanket excuse for the use of all materials, even if it is in the classroom. Each use must be weighed against the 4 fair use factors. Copyright law dictates that each use be evaluated against these 4 factors. The purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of a commercial nature or is for nonprofit educational purposes. The nature of the copyrighted work. The amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. One thing to keep in mind is that no one factor necessarily weighs more than the other, and there may not be a clear-cut determination even after weighing the use against the 4 fair use factors. In fact, it is more likely that each use will fall within an acceptable range. I always recommend that you document your justification. Attempting a fair use justification and using a work in good faith may be helpful if anyone were to claim a copyright infringement. Let's look at an example. So a faculty member copies a recent newspaper article for each student in a face-to-face class. Is this fair use? Let's look at the factors. The purpose is nonprofit educational face-to-face classroom use, which is explicitly allowed under Section 107. The nature of the work is published, primarily factual in nature and not published for education. It also has limited creative expression. The amount of the work is used in its entirety, but it is necessary to accomplish a specific need. There will be little to no impact on the market of the original work with this use. So, after reviewing all 4 fair use factors, we can clearly see that this situation falls under fair use. The faculty member is well within his or her rights to distribute the article in class. Although no one factor weighs more than the other in favor of fair use, you might want to ask yourself if your use is transformative. What does transformative mean? Well, that's best answered by 2 questions. 1. Has the material you have taken from the original work been transformed by adding new expression or meaning? And 2. Was value added to the original by creating new information, new aesthetics, insights, and understandings? Let's take a look at some examples to see transformative use in action. The first image is a photograph of a pregnant Demi Moore on the cover of Vanity Fair. Annie Leibovitz, a well-known photographer, took this picture. Now take a look at the image to the right. This is a movie poster for Naked Gun 33 1/3, The Final Insult. Would you consider the use transformative? Is the poster's use of the image fair use? Remember your questions. Does the image on the right have new meaning? Was value added by creating new information or understandings? Take a moment to think about it. One could argue that the intent of the poster is totally different from the image used in the magazine. One is taken for the sake of art, while the other is clearly marketing for an unrelated movie. Given the tagline, "Do This March," the use of an image of a pregnant woman makes sense. And remember, when Demi Moore posed for the picture, it was a big deal. Actresses had not normally been photographed nude while pregnant. To re-envision the photo in something so absurd as the image to the right definitely brings new meaning. So yes, in this case, this is fair use as the movie poster was sufficiently transformative. Now how about this example? First we have the book The Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss, a well-known children's book about a mischievous kitty, versus The Cat Not in the Hat, a parody by Dr. Juice, a story depicted in the style of Dr. Seuss's book, but that is actually about the O.J. Simpson murder trial. Would you consider this use transformative? Has value been added or new understandings to the original work? Take a moment to think about how the courts may have ruled. Alas, no. This use is not considered transformative. Although the author claimed it was a parody, it is not actually a parody of the Dr. Seuss work. It is a work of satire and commentary on the O.J. Simpson trial using the style of Dr. Seuss. Ultimately, the courts ruled against the author of The Cat Not in the Hat. Fair use is often considered a gray area as the language of the law is intentionally vague. So in response, publishers and the academic community met to attempt to establish a set of educational fair use guidelines to provide, quote, greater certainty and protections for instructors. While the guidelines are not part of the Federal Copyright Act, they are recognized by courts and the Copyright Office as minimum standards for fair use in education. A teacher or pupil following the guidelines can feel comfortable that a use falling within these guidelines is a permissible fair use and not an infringement. The educational use guidelines can be found in Circular 21, provided by the Copyright Office. Keep in mind that none of these guidelines permit creation of course packs. They only allow uses that involve copying much less material. The guidelines permit a teacher to make one copy of any of the following: a chapter from a book, an article from a periodical or newspaper, a short story, short essay, or short poem, a chart, graph, diagram, drawing, cartoon, or picture from a book, periodical, or newspaper. Teachers also may photocopy articles to hand out in class, but the guidelines impose restrictions. For example, classroom copying cannot be used to replace texts or workbooks used in the classroom. Students cannot be charged more than the actual cost of photocopying. The number of copies cannot exceed more than one copy per student, and a notice of copyright must be affixed to each copy. Examples of what can be copied and distributed in class include a complete poem if less than 250 words, or an excerpt of not more than 250 words from a longer poem. A complete article, short story, or essay if less than 2,500 words, or an excerpt from any prose work of not more than 1,000 words, or 10% of the work, whichever is less. Or one chart, graph, diagram, drawing, cartoon, or picture per book or per periodical issue. Not more than one short poem, article, etc. may be copied from the same author, nor more than 3 from the same collective work or periodical volume. As a general rule, a teacher has more freedom to copy from newspapers or other periodicals if the copying is related to current events. The idea to make the copies must come from the teacher, not from school administrators or other higher authority. Only 9 instances of such copying for one course during one school term are permitted. In addition, the idea to make copies and their actual classroom use must be so close together in time that it would be unreasonable to expect a timely reply to a permissible use. For example, the instructor finds a News Weekly article on capital punishment 2 days before presenting a lecture on the subject. Teachers may not photocopy workbooks, texts, standardized tests, or other materials that were created for educational use. The guidelines were not intended to allow teachers to usurp the profits of educational publishers. In other words, educational publishers do not consider it a fair use if the copying provides replacements or substitutes for the purchase of books, reprints, periodicals, tests, workbooks, anthologies, compilations, or collective works. Just keep in mind, however, this is not law. It is an agreement between publishers and the educational community. More flexibility may be allowed under fair use. So now that you have an introduction to fair use, we can move on to the Teach Act. Join us for the 4th video in the series.